Hello again, family. Back again for another Sunday Gospel reflection. Today's reading comes from the Gospel of Luke, chapter 9, verse 11 through 17. And it's actually the only miracle story that's in all four Gospel accounts. So it's kind of cool to read. We're going to go through Luke's account today. But if you wanted to do some further reading, you could read the other accounts that have, some more details or some less details, depending on which Gospel you read it in. So we'll go ahead and get going with it. Luke 9, verse 11 through 17. When the crowds learned it, they followed him. And he welcomed them and spoke to them of the kingdom of God and cured those who had need of healing. Now the day began to wear away, and the 12 came to him and said, "Send the crowd away to go into the villages and country round about, to lodge and get provisions. For we are here in a lonely place." But he said to them, "You give them something to eat." They said, "We have no more than 5 loaves and 2 fish, unless we are to go and buy food for all these people." For there were about 5,000 men. And he said to his disciples, "Make them sit down in companies, about 50 each." And they did so, and made them all sit down. And taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, he looked up to heaven, and he blessed and broke them, and gave them to the disciples to set before the crowd. And all ate and were satisfied. And they took up what was left over, 12 baskets of broken pieces. So, really powerful, miraculous story here. And to give you some context, because it starts out kind of weird, it just says, when the crowds learned it, they followed him. So this is in the middle of the Gospel of Luke, where Jesus is well known, preaching and teaching and doing miracles, and he has a big following, not just the 12 and the disciples, but people that were in the area and just curious of, who is this miracle worker? Who is this Jesus? What is his message? Who is this carpenter from Nazareth, right? So the context is that Jesus sends the 12 out on mission. So they go out on mission. They are given the authority by Jesus to heal the sick, to cast out demons, and to proclaim the gospel into the villages. So they go and they do that, and they come back. And that's also in, I think it's the Gospel of John. It might be in, maybe it's not, but it's in one of the other Gospels. And they come back and they're telling Jesus their stories. And it's after this occasion that Jesus says, "Okay, let's go get some rest. Let's go to Bethsaida." And as Dr. Petrie pointed out, and when I was preparing for this, it seemed that Herod might be kind of on the lookout for Jesus. So Jesus wanted to kind of get out of town for a little bit. So he says, "Let's go get some rest." So that's where we're at. The disciples, they come back from mission. Jesus says, "Let's go get some rest." So they're going to switch towns. They're going to switch gears. But then it says, when the crowds learned it, they followed him. And the next line is, and he welcomed them. So Jesus welcomes the crowds, even though he's leaving to go get some rest. Jesus never turns anyone away. He never turns us away. He didn't turn them away, and he's surely not going to turn us away. So I thought that was really interesting. Just a little line like that. That's how powerful the gospel is and can speak to us. Just these little lines. That he welcomed them and spoke to them of the kingdom of God, and he cured those that had a need of healing. So I read that, and a lot of times in the Gospels it says Jesus healed all that came to him. He healed everyone. And in here it says he cured those that had a need of healing. And I started reflecting on this because what we want and what we need are not two of the same things all the time. Sometimes what we want, we don't actually need. And see, God being love, right? Love is willing the good of the other, and that's what God is. So God, in his perfect love, knows exactly what we need, because the goal of life isn't necessarily to be healed on this side of heaven. Once we get to heaven, we'll all be healed. But the goal of this life is to be holy. And Hebrews says, without being holy, you will not see the face of God. And the goal of this life is to see the face of God, to be holy. So sometimes if we get what we want, it might lead us away from our real goal of heaven and being healed eternally and spending eternity with God. So that's another thing that stuck out to me. Then Jesus says, then the apostles say to Jesus, send the crowd away, because see, it's getting late. It's getting late there, and just that. It's getting late, it's starting to get dark, and they're in a deserted place. Here the translation says a lonely place. Other translations say deserted, and this is where you can make, scholars point out that Jesus is the new Moses. He's feeding the crowds in the desert, like in the Old Testament, in the book of Exodus, as Moses leads the Israelites through the Red Sea, into the wilderness, into the desert, into the lonely place. God feeds them with manna. And here, Jesus, the new Moses, and even a better Moses, is leading the people out into a lonely place, into the desert, and feeding them with miraculous bread. So you see the kind of the implication of Jesus being the new Moses here. And so the apostles are thinking with a human mind. They're saying, hey, there's no food out here. There's a lot of people. It's getting late. There's no provisions. We can't do anything. Jesus, tell these people to leave you to go get some food. And Jesus says, you feed them. You give them some food, right? And, just going back a second here, the people, I put myself in their shoes, and they followed Jesus into this deserted place. They obviously weren't too worried about what they were going to eat. They knew it was getting late. They knew there was no food out there. They wanted the Lord. Are we so inclined to follow Jesus, to abandon ourselves, to follow Jesus to the extent where we don't really know provision? I'm not saying to be reckless in that way, but there is some truth there that maybe we need to follow the Lord a little bit more closely and a little bit more recklessly, not to a crazy abandon, but I think you know what I'm saying. Maybe it's something for us to take to prayer. And where, I know for myself, I look out for all these things like the apostles were, and tend to follow the Lord after I know everything is in place for me to follow the Lord. And these people were just following Jesus. They wanted to hear what he was going to say. They wanted his healing. They wanted to be around him. And I need a little bit more of that abandonment in my life, in my relationship with the Lord. So back to the verse here, Jesus says, you give them something to eat. Jesus knowing that they couldn't. But it speaks to the point that Jesus wants us to participate in what he's doing. Jesus wants our participation in his miracles. And if you remember, I think it's the Gospel of John, he sends the apostles out. Hey, go get some food. So they go out, and a boy gives them 2 fish and 5 loaves. So they bring it back to Jesus. And Jesus is like, what do you got? And they're like, we only got 2 fish and 5 loaves, and there's 5,000 men. And scholars predict that there was closer to 15 to 20,000 people, including women and children. So there's a lot of people. There's a stadium full of people, and they got 2 loaves and 5 fish. Kind of like, all right, Jesus, what are we going to do? So Jesus gives the command. He says, make them sit down in companies of about 50 each. Now think about it from an apostle's perspective. There's 2 loaves and 5 fish. There's 15 to 20,000 people. What good does it do to sit these people down in the groups of 50? What good? But they do it. They're obedient to God. Even though they didn't know where it was going to lead, they didn't know how these people were going to get fed, they didn't know what Jesus was going to do, but they listened to him anyway. And how often in our life do we want to know the outcome before we're obedient? Before we follow Jesus, before we do what we know he's asking us to do, we want to know the outcome. And that's really not how the spiritual life works. Jesus wants us to trust him. He wants us to be obedient to him, even to the point where we don't know how he's going to do what he's going to do. But that's when the miracle comes. Through our radical obedience and radical trust, that's when Jesus can do miracles. And I honestly believe in my own life and in the life of the church in general that there's not more miracles going on because we don't trust Jesus that much. We're not obedient, and we don't actually trust him to the radical point where we need to trust him so he can display his miraculous power. So after the apostles are obedient and everyone sits down in 50, because think about how long that would have taken to sit everybody down in groups of 50. I mean, a lot of people, right? So Jesus, I love this part. It says he takes the 5 loaves and 2 fish. He looks up to heaven. He blessed, he broke, and he gave. Where have we heard that before? How about every Mass where the priest says he blessed, he took bread, he blessed it, he broke it, and he gave it. And Jesus repeats these same exact words at the Last Supper. So this is a prefigurement of the Eucharist in which we are going to be fed in every Mass. Wow, just learning more about the Eucharist and how the Old Testament Israelites were fed the miraculous bread in heaven, and going through John 6, and Jesus says, you know, he who eats my flesh and drinks my blood, and I am the bread that come down from heaven. So we get to participate in the new covenant manna, which is Jesus himself at every Mass. And this is a prefigurement of every Mass where Jesus, the high priest, takes bread, looks up to heaven, he blesses it, he breaks it, and he gives it. And again, he uses the disciples because it's actually at the hands of the disciples that the miracle happens. Jesus does the miracle, but again, he wants the participation. So it says he gave them to the disciples to set before the crowd. So Jesus does the miracle, but asks the disciples to participate, and the disciples are the ones that distribute the bread and the fish to the crowd. So again, it just shows that Jesus doesn't want to work independent of us. He wants to work in cooperation with us because we're in a covenant relationship with the Lord, and he wants to unite us together as brothers and sisters with him and in him as well. So it's just, you know, there's so much to be said for this story. And then it says, and all ate and were satisfied. So again, obedience, trusting in God, following God radically leads to an abundance, to where everyone is satisfied. There was leftovers, and there was leftover enough for every apostle to get a basket full. There was 12 baskets of leftovers. So it's just the abundance of God. When we radically trust and obey him, we can see his miracles and we will not leave him unsatisfied. One thing I think we can focus on in our prayer this week is, what do we focus on? Because the apostles were focused on what they didn't have. They didn't have enough food. It was getting late. They were focused on the real elements, which we need to consider. They were focused on those elements. They were focused on what they didn't have. But what if we focused on what we do have? Because see, in my life, I can focus on if I only had this amount of money, if I only lived here, if I only had this or whatever. You know, if you fill in the blank. If you only had this, then you could do more for God. Then you would have more time. Then you would have more energy. And then you could really do some work for God. But what if we focused on, God, you've given me this gift. Help me to use this gift. You know, and then watch Jesus produce the miracle as we give the gifts that he's given us, as we give them back to God. Because if you remember, it was the boy that gave the 2 fish and the 5 loaves. Nobody else gave food. Now, out of 20,000 people, I bet more than one boy had food, but they weren't willing to give it up. But the boy was willing to give. And Jesus took those 2 loaves and those 5 fish, and he did the miracle. But if Jesus didn't have any food to work with, if nobody gave, I don't think Jesus would have done the miracle, because he only blessed what was given to him. He only blessed the 2 fish and the 5 loaves that were surrendered to him. So what can we surrender to God? What gifts has God given us that we can, in fact, return to God, ask for his blessing, and ask him to do a miracle through what he's already given us? So I ask you to take that to prayer as I take that to prayer this week. Please pray for me as I pray for you, and I hope you have a blessed Sunday and a blessed week, and we'll see you again next Sunday.